May 20th, 1948. Twilight over the Negev. The desert holds its breath. Wind drifts low across the dunes, carrying the scent of oil and dust. Far above, 4 aircraft trace uncertain lines against the dying light. Not modern fighters, not even true squadrons, but a handful of patched machines stitched together from the wreckage of another war. Their wings rattle. Their engines cough. Yet they carry the fate of a newborn country. Below them, a column of Egyptian armor crawls north toward Tel Aviv. Tanks, trucks, artillery, their engines rumbling through the sand like thunder. The road glows faintly in the evening haze. Over the convoy circles a single Spitfire painted with Egyptian markings. Its pilot, a veteran of the Luftwaffe, once trained over the skies of Europe. Now he hunts for prey beneath the same sun that burned over El Alamein. The Israeli formation climbs unevenly. 4 Avia S-199s, Czech-built relics of the German Messerschmitt 109. Their pilots are untested, their airframes barely functional. In the cockpits sit men who learned to fly only months ago, volunteers from scattered lands, a farmer from Ramat Gan, an American veteran of the Pacific, a refugee who had once crossed the Alps on foot. Their commander is Modi Alon, 27 years old, calm, decisive, already carrying the silence of command. The radio crackles with static. No clear frequency, no navigation system, just instinct and faith. Ahead, the horizon flickers with the faint reflection of metal. The Egyptian column, the first true target in the history of Israel's Air Force. Alon gives a simple order: attack. No one answers. The command is unnecessary. They dive. Engines roar. The sound tearing across the open desert. The first bombs fall too soon, exploding in plumes of sand. The second strike finds its mark. A fuel truck, a sudden burst of fire. Panic ripples through the convoy. Egyptian soldiers scatter for cover. Anti-aircraft guns twist skyward, firing wildly into the darkening sky. The Israeli planes pull upward, their wings trembling under the strain. Out of the sun descends the Egyptian Spitfire. The pilot sees the strange silhouettes of the attackers and cannot believe what he's witnessing. German-designed fighters flown by Jews. He banks hard, cutting into their climb, guns blazing. Alon jerks his stick, feeling the plane shudder, the old engine resisting. For a heartbeat, time dissolves. 1948 folding into 1945, the victors and victims of the last war meeting again over a new battlefield. The Israeli turns. One burst, a flicker of tracer fire. The Spitfire wavers, smoke trailing from its wing. It vanishes into the horizon. In the cockpit, Alon breathes once, steady. The desert below burns in patches. Trucks overturned, columns broken. The 4 Israeli planes pull north toward Tel Aviv, their engines barely holding. Behind them lies silence, the kind that follows disbelief. On the ground, the Egyptian advance halts. Commanders shout over broken radios, unsure what force has struck them. Rumors spread. The Jews have planes, German planes. Some swear they saw Luftwaffe markings, others claim they were ghosts. Confusion spreads faster than fear. By the time night falls, the 4 aircraft have vanished into the sky. Their mission is unrecorded, their survival uncertain. But across the sand, the echo of their engines lingers. A sound no one expected, a defiance that cannot yet be named. In one night, 4 men in 4 failing machines changed the course of a war. They were not supposed to win. They were only supposed to try. The day before that flight, there was no Air Force, only a handful of men and a dream that outpaced reality. Israel had declared independence on May 14, 1948, and by dawn of the next day, 5 Arab armies were crossing its borders. From the north came Syria and Lebanon. From the east, Transjordan's Arab Legion. From the south, Egypt. And from the west, the sea itself, blockaded and watched. The British were gone, their empire dissolving behind them, leaving a vacuum filled by chaos. Tel Aviv had no sky defense. Its people watched as Egyptian bombers appeared suddenly out of the clouds, dropping payloads over the city's heart. Explosions tore through the central bus station, killing dozens, streets filled with dust and screams. It was the first air raid in the nation's history, and the first proof that survival would require mastery of the air. The new government gathered in a half-empty office in the old red house near the shore. Maps of the country lay pinned to walls with nails. The air minister, still in civilian clothes, listened as reports came in from every front. Egypt's Air Force ruled the skies. They were trained, equipped, and confident. Israel, by contrast, had nothing but scattered pilots, borrowed courage, and a few crated aircraft stranded in Europe under embargo. Those crates, marked as farm equipment, were stored in a warehouse in Czechoslovakia, remnants of World War II. The planes were Avia S-199s, built from the frame of the German Messerschmitt Bf-109, but fitted with the wrong engines. Even the Germans had hated them. They were heavy, unstable, and known among Czech mechanics as mezek, the mule. But for Israel, they were salvation in parts. Volunteers from around the world, veterans of the RAF, the U.S. Air Force, and young refugees who had never seen a cockpit, gathered at a secret base in Žatec, Czechoslovakia. They learned to fly these temperamental machines in weeks, not months. Every flight was a gamble. Propellers cracked, engines burst into flame, landing gear failed without warning. Yet one by one, they climbed into the sky. The newly formed Israeli Air Force was born, fragile, untested, but alive. The planes had to be smuggled home. Each one was dismantled, packed into wooden crates, and flown piece by piece through Yugoslavia under false clearance. British intelligence caught rumors of the operation but could not prove it. The crates finally arrived in Israel just days before the first Egyptian advance. Mechanics worked under torchlight through the nights, piecing metal and hope together on an airstrip at Ekron. They had no manuals, no spare parts, and no time. When the first Avia rolled to the runway, it looked like a ghost of an older war. The black cross on its fuselage still visible under a hurried coat of blue paint. Yet in that moment it represented more than an aircraft. It was a declaration that Israel would not surrender its sky. The men who would fly them came from everywhere. Some spoke Hebrew, others Yiddish, English, or Czech. Many had fought fascism only a few years before. Now they would fight the remnants of it again. Pilots who had once worn the eagle of the Reich, now wearing the insignia of Egypt. History had twisted itself into irony. In Tel Aviv, people walked the streets beneath a sky they could not yet trust. Each distant engine sound sent eyes upward, fear and faith interwoven. The government ordered blackout curtains. Hospitals prepared for new raids. Yet in the midst of this fear, news spread in whispers. Planes have arrived. Not many, not strong, but ours. On May 20th, 4 of them would take off for the first time. Against orders, against logic, against odds, no strategist would have accepted. They would carry no radar, no escort, and barely enough ammunition for a single pass. But they would carry something greater than weapons, the belief that the air above this new land could belong to its people. In those few days between birth and battle, a nation learned what it meant to breathe under siege. Every bomb that fell was a reminder that independence was not yet freedom. Freedom would have to be fought for, wing by wing, sky by sky. The war on the ground had boundaries, roads, front lines, trenches. The war in the air had none. By late May, Egyptian aircraft owned the sky. Their pilots were veterans, trained under British command during the war, flying Spitfires with engines that purred like confidence. They swept low over the coastal plain, bombing bridges, convoys, and towns. Their targets were not soldiers, but the heart of the newborn state. Roads, water lines, the crowded streets of Tel Aviv. On May 19th, Egyptian planes struck again, dropping bombs on the city's central bus station. The explosions echoed across miles of coastline. Fires burned through the night. Dozens died. Hundreds were injured. It was not simply an attack. It was humiliation. The government in Tel Aviv watched helplessly, with no way to strike back. For the people below, the sky had become an enemy. The Egyptian Air Force had been rebuilt in the years after the war with British aid. Its aircraft, Spitfires and C-47 bombers, were modern, fast, and plentiful. But what made them truly formidable were their pilots. Among them were men who had once flown for the Luftwaffe. German aces, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and North Africa. After 1945, some were hired as mercenaries, drawn by pay and the promise of flying again. They brought discipline, experience, and a familiar arrogance. To the Israelis, this irony cut deep. The very pilots who had once bombed London and Warsaw were now bombing Tel Aviv, under Egyptian colors, but with the same skill that had terrorized Europe. History had not ended in 1945. It had simply changed uniforms. Inside Israel, the pressure mounted. Every bombing run pushed the front lines closer. The Egyptian army advancing up the coast was within days of Tel Aviv. On the map, there was no defense left to hold them. Only the sky remained, empty, unguarded, waiting. In the underground hangar at Ekron, the air smelled of fuel and metal. Mechanics worked without rest, tightening bolts, patching holes, and praying engines would hold. The 4 Avia S-109 stood in a row, their fuselages gleaming in the heat. They were not ready. Their guns jammed, their engines overheated after minutes in flight. But there was no choice left. The commanders gathered around a makeshift table, maps pinned down with wrenches, coffee growing cold. The question was simple. Do we wait for more planes, or do we fly now? Waiting meant losing the war before it began. Flying meant risking the last chance they had. Modi Alon, calm as ever, said little. He looked over the map, tracing his finger along the Egyptian advance north of Ashdod. The enemy was only 30 kilometers away. By the next morning, they could be at Tel Aviv's edge. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. "If we don't stop them now," he said, "we never will." The decision was made. The order was written by hand, unsigned. Launch at first light, no fanfare, no ceremony, only duty. As dawn approached, the pilots prepared. They strapped on parachutes still marked with foreign insignia. Each checked the limited ammunition, just enough for a brief skirmish. One of them placed a small piece of paper inside his pocket, a list of radio frequencies that probably wouldn't work. They were men standing at the edge of history, carrying machines held together by wire and prayer. Yet somewhere within that exhaustion was conviction, the belief that the sky could change everything. If they failed, Israel would fall. If they succeeded, even briefly, it would be enough to prove that the impossible could be done. Outside, the sound of the Egyptian engines returned, faint but distinct. The city tensed, the horizon glowed, and 4 pilots climbed into their cockpits, facing not just an enemy above Shah, but the memory of one they thought they had already buried. When they rose into the air, they were not chasing victory. They were chasing survival, one flight between darkness and the right to exist. The hangar at Ekron smelled of oil and desperation. Floodlights buzzed in the darkness, throwing pale light over the skeletal frames of 4 newly assembled aircraft. Their wings were still streaked with grease. The paint on their fuselages had not yet dried. Mechanics worked through the night, tightening bolts with trembling hands. Every screw, every cable mattered. Each failure could mean the end of a country less than a week old. The Avia S-109 was a creature of contradictions, a relic of the Luftwaffe built by survivors of its war. The Czech engineers who had sold them warned that the planes were unstable, their engines mismatched, their handling treacherous. Israeli pilots nicknamed them Messerschmitt. Yet they were all that existed, the only aircraft between an army and annihilation. Around a table lit by a single lamp, the first generation of the Israeli Air Force gathered. Maps were spread across the surface, held down by pistols and coffee mugs. Their commander, Modi Alon, stood with folded arms, studying the black line of the Egyptian advance. Beside him, Leonard, a Hungarian-born pilot who had fought with the U.S. Marines in the Pacific, smoked quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the hangar wall. Their orders were clear and impossible. Intercept the Egyptian column moving north along the coast toward Tel Aviv. Intelligence reports described tanks, trucks, artillery, an invasion force designed to crush the city in a single day. The new state had no army large enough to stop it, no artillery to match it, no air defense to slow it. Only 4 aircraft, 4 men, and the element of surprise. Alon spoke little. "We hit them before they reach the city," he said simply. "If we die, they stop anyway." The room was silent. There was nothing more to plan. Mechanics checked the ammunition. 20-millimeter cannons prone to jamming, machine guns that sometimes fired only in bursts. Each pilot memorized his targets: fuel trucks, tank columns, supply convoys. They would dive fast, fire once, and climb out before the engines failed. No radio coordination, no second wave. As dawn approached, the hangar door creaked open to the cold air. The sky glowed faintly over the Judean hills, and the sound of engines testing broke the stillness. The first aircraft coughed, sputtered, then caught. A column of smoke rose from the exhaust. The mechanics stepped back, eyes half closed against the dust. One after another, the planes came alive. Rough, uneven, but alive. They painted quick blue stars of David over faint black crosses that still lingered beneath the surface. The irony was heavy, but unspoken. These machines, once symbols of terror, would now defend those they were built to destroy. It was history turning itself inside out. Leonard checked his cockpit. The glass canopy rattled in its frame. The control stick resisted every movement. He looked down at the photo of his mother taped beside the instruments, the only thing he had brought from home. Alon gave a nod from his own plane, the gesture small, final. The mechanics stood at the edges of the strip as the engines roared. Dust swirled. The ground trembled. For a moment it seemed the planes would never lift. Too heavy, too flawed. Then one by one they rose, struggling against gravity until suddenly they were free, the noise fading into distance. Below, the men watched in silence. They did not cheer. They knew what the pilots were flying into. Over the radio came a faint voice, nearly drowned by static. Formation in air. Heading south. For the first time in its brief existence, the state of Israel had an air force. Not powerful, not prepared, but real. 4 pilots, 4 planes, 1 mission. To strike an army and prove that the sky could belong to them. No one expected them to return. But they had already won the most important battle, the refusal to surrender before they had even begun. The desert slept under a thin layer of haze. From above, it looked endless, a pale sea with no horizon. Against that silence, 4 engines tore open the night. The Avia S-109s, their noses trembling, clawed their way south from the dusty strip at Ekron. It was the first combat flight in the history of Israel's Air Force. No escort, no radar, no certainty. Only instinct, and a sky that seemed far too wide. In Alan's cockpit, the vibration blurred the gauges. The plane's engine strained as if in protest. Below him, the faint glow of campfires marked the Egyptian column winding north. Trucks, tanks, fuel carriers, a steel river crawling through sand. Every mile they advanced was a mile closer to Tel Aviv. He glanced to his left. 3 silhouettes held formation. Leonard, Eddie Cohen, and Ezer Weizman. Their wings rocked slightly in the turbulence. They had no formation training together, no shared radio discipline. Yet in the dark, each pilot read the other's movements by feel, by faith. The air smelled of fuel and ozone. The engine threatened to seize at any moment, but there was no turning back. They flew low, almost skimming the dunes to avoid Egyptian radar. The Mediterranean shimmered far to the west, silver under moonlight. Somewhere behind it, the city waited, sleepless, trembling, listening for the sound of its defenders. Alon led the climb. The planes rose slowly, engines coughing in protest. Sweat rolled down his back beneath the flight suit. He checked the altimeter, too low, too slow, but the target was near. The column below came into view. Hundreds of vehicles spread across a narrow road, their headlights blacked out, their shapes glinting faintly under the moon. He leveled the wings. One squeeze of the radio trigger. Static. Then a single word. Attack. The four planes broke apart like shards of light. Leonard dove first, releasing bombs that fell with uneven rhythm before striking a line of trucks. Fire blossomed across the road, orange and violent. Alon followed, his cannon spitting brief, erratic bursts. The recoil shook the plane. He saw flashes of metal, men scattering for cover, black smoke rising from fuel carriers. From the convoy, anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Red tracers arced upward, too slow to catch the diving planes. The sky turned into a web of light. Alon pulled back hard on the stick. The aircraft groaned as it climbed. His guns jammed. He struck the side of the cockpit with his glove, swore under his breath, then turned again for another pass. Eddie Cohen's plane wobbled in the distance. He was hit, not fatally, but enough to force a retreat. His voice crackled once through the static, then vanished. The rest continued, circling, diving, firing until ammunition ran dry. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, the convoy below was chaos. Burning vehicles, broken formation, soldiers running into the desert. The Israelis banked north, engines barely holding. One by one, they climbed back into the dark, leaving behind a trail of smoke and disbelief. Below, the Egyptian officers shouted orders into radios that no longer worked. Some believed they had been attacked by British forces. Others swore the Luftwaffe had returned. None could comprehend that the new Jewish state, barely days old, had struck from the air. The flight home was silent. Each pilot flew alone, guided only by memory and starlight. Alon's plane shook violently. Oil sprayed across the canopy. When he landed at Ekron, the wheels hit hard, bouncing across the strip before settling. The engine died the moment it stopped. Lenart landed next, his fuel nearly gone. Weizman circled once before dropping down in a cloud of dust. Mechanics ran forward, their hands trembling as they counted survivors. 3 planes returned. 1 was missing. The men stepped from their cockpits into the cool night air. No one spoke. They looked south toward the faint glow of burning fuel on the horizon. For the first time, the Egyptian advance had halted. The air war had begun, and with it, the legend of a sky reclaimed. Above the desert, the smoke of battle drifted into stillness. The night, at last, belonged to them. The desert held its breath once more. Midnight had passed, but the war had not slept. The Egyptian column lay scattered, its forward units stalled in confusion, its officers shouting into radios that returned only static. Above, the air shimmered with the echo of engines that were no longer there. Yet in the distance, another sound rose, sharper, cleaner, the howl of Egyptian Spitfires taking flight from El Arish. They came hunting for ghosts. The Egyptian Air Force had dispatched its best, men who had flown under the banner of the Luftwaffe just 3 years earlier. Their leader, a former ace of the Western Front, had fought in the skies over France and North Africa. Now he soared over the same desert, unaware that below him waited pilots whose families had died under his flag. The irony of history was too cruel to name. Far to the north, Modi Alon and Lou Lenart refueled at Ekron. their planes patched with canvas and wire. They had barely landed when the order came. Another Egyptian flight had crossed the coast, heading for Tel Aviv. The men exchanged a glance, exhaustion buried beneath resolve. Engines coughed back to life. They lifted again into the night. The two forces met over the coastline where the moonlight turned the sea into steel. The Egyptians, flying Spitfires and Macchis, held every advantage: altitude, speed, experience. The Israelis, flying temperamental Avias, held only audacity. It was enough. Alon spotted the first Spitfire silhouetted against the horizon. He climbed toward it, closing the distance, the engine groaning under strain. Tracers flashed past his wing, too close. He banked sharply, diving into the darkness, then pulled up behind the enemy's tail. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the reticle in his gun sight. He fired. One burst. Two. The cannons jammed, then coughed. Smoke poured from the Spitfire's engine. It rolled once, twice, and fell toward the sea in silence. Leonard engaged the second. The Egyptian pilot looped high, confident, then dove to pursue. The Israeli jerked his plane sideways, the Avia's fragile frame creaking. The maneuver should have torn the wings apart, but it held. The enemy overshot, exposed for an instant. Lennart fired a short burst. Sparks bloomed along the Spitfire's fuselage. It spiraled out, vanishing into the dark. The sky burned in streaks of red and white. Above the coast, anti-aircraft fire from Tel Aviv joined the chaos, tracing arcs of light that briefly illuminated the combatants. German-built planes flown by Jews against Spitfires flown by Germans serving Arabs. The air was thick with irony and smoke. Alon's radio hissed. A single voice broke through. "Target down!" He didn't know who said it. He didn't ask. There was no time. A shadow passed across his canopy. Another Spitfire diving. He rolled, fired blindly, felt bullets hammer his wing. The plane shuddered but stayed aloft. The enemy climbed again, pursued by tracers that vanished into blackness. Minutes blurred into eternity. Then, silence. The Egyptians broke away, turning south, their formation fractured. The Israelis circled once, twice, scanning the horizon. Nothing but the sea and the hum of engines barely holding together. Below, Tel Aviv glowed faintly. Not from fire, but from lights reappearing in windows. For the first time since the invasion began, the city was unafraid. People stepped into the streets and looked upward, searching the night sky. They could not see the pilots, but they could hear the sound. Rough, uneven, but theirs. Alon led the return, flying low along the coast. When he landed at Ekron, his engine sputtered once, then died. The field crew rushed forward, cheering quietly, almost in disbelief. He climbed from the cockpit, face streaked with oil, and looked east toward the horizon. Somewhere in the darkness, the Egyptian Spitfires retreated home. The duel had lasted less than 15 minutes. It would echo for decades. Two worlds had met in the night sky. The ghosts of Europe's war and the birth of a new nation. The past had hunted the future and lost. Above the desert, the wind carried the fading sound of engines. It was no longer the noise of fear. It was the rhythm of existence, raw, fragile, defiant. That night, Israel's Air Force was not just born. It remembered how to fly. When dawn came, it brought no triumph, only silence. The horizon over the Negev glowed faintly pink, the kind of light that makes every shadow seem longer. At Ekron Airfield, 3 planes stood motionless, their engines still warm, their wings riddled with bullet holes. The 4th was missing. The men waited, scanning the sky until the sun climbed too high to pretend anymore. The missing pilot, Eddie Cohen, would never return. His plane had gone down somewhere between Ashdod and the desert road. Its wreckage later found smoldering in the dunes. He had been 26 years old, a volunteer who had left South Africa to fight for a nation that existed only on paper when he first arrived. His death was the first among Israeli airmen, and the price of the impossible. No one spoke. Mechanics removed their caps, their hands black with oil. Alon stood beside the broken wing of his own plane, staring south, listening to the distant echo of artillery. Around him the desert began to wake. Birds rising, engines starting, the machinery of another day. But the air felt heavier, as if the night's victory had cost more than it gave. The Egyptian advance had stopped. Reports from the front confirmed it. The convoy hit outside Ashdod had retreated, confused and disoriented. Tel Aviv, for now, was safe. Yet the weight of loss settled like dust over the airfield. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. In the following days, the British press caught the story. Jewish pilots in German planes rout Egyptian column, one headline read. The irony spread like wildfire. Former victims of the Luftwaffe flying German-built aircraft to defeat German mercenaries fighting for Egypt. Across Europe, people read in disbelief. But for those in the hangar, there was no poetry in irony. There was only exhaustion, grief, and the need to fly again. The young Air Force had no time to mourn. New missions came daily. Supply runs, reconnaissance, air cover for ground units pushing south. Mechanics scavenged spare parts from wreckage. Pilots slept beside their planes, waking to the sound of generators and distant gunfire. Every flight carried the memory of the first. Every takeoff felt like a question. Will we return this time? One evening, as the sun bled red over the coastal plain, Alon sat alone on a crate outside the hangar. His flight log lay open on his knee, a list of names and dates in smudged pencil. Cohen's name remained on the roster, unmarked. After a long moment, Alon closed the book. He knew what that meant. The war would demand more names before it was done. The losses continued. Engines failed mid-air. One Avia crashed on landing. Yet with each mission, the pilots grew stronger. They learned to fly the aircraft not as it was built, but as it was, unpredictable, fragile, alive in its own strange rhythm. Each pilot carried a photograph, a prayer, a silence that grew heavier with every sortie. The war taught them to accept imperfection. They fought with what they had, not what they wished for. They learned that survival was not about superiority, but endurance. Every return to the runway, every breath under an open canopy, was defiance against extinction. In Haifa, a new shipment of engines arrived from Czechoslovakia. Reinforcements followed. More volunteers, more aircraft, more pieces of an air force that still lacked uniforms, ranks, or medals. The men joked that the hangar smelled like oil, dust, and faith. But behind their laughter was the quiet knowledge that faith alone could not hold the sky forever. When night fell, Alon walked to the edge of the runway. The stars above the desert seemed endless, the same stars that had guided ships, exiles, and prophets for centuries. Somewhere out there, he imagined, Cohen was still flying, part of the sky he had helped reclaim. The silence pressed close, broken only by the wind against the metal fuselage. The desert kept its secrets. In every victory, there is a price too sacred to name. For the first airmen of Israel, the cost was written not in medals, but in absence, in the empty space where one plane should have landed, and did not. Morning broke over the coastal plain with a strange stillness. The city that had trembled for a week beneath sirens and explosions now woke to quiet. No engines, no warnings, only the distant hum of the sea and the slow return of breath. Tel Aviv was still standing. Its streets, scarred by craters and smoke, were already filling with people. Children stepped cautiously from shelters, their eyes lifted toward a sky that for the first time did not bring fear. From the rooftops, families could see faint trails of smoke on the southern horizon, reminders of the night before. They didn't know who had fought there or how close the danger had come. They only knew that something had changed. The Egyptians had stopped. The bombs had stopped. For the first time since the Declaration of Independence, the city could breathe. At Ekron Airfield, the survivors moved in slow silence. Mechanics worked without speaking, replacing panels, patching holes with salvaged metal, cleaning oil from the cockpits. Every aircraft looked both broken and sacred, relics that had saved a people. The pilots rested on crates and fuel drums, faces drawn, uniforms stained with grease and exhaustion. None of them had slept more than an hour, but none dared leave. The war might return at any moment. Alon stood apart, his flight jacket draped loosely over his shoulders. He watched as another aircraft was wheeled toward the hangar, its engine still coughing, its paint scorched by heat. It was difficult to believe these fragile machines had held back an army. Yet there they were, solid proof that the impossible had not only been attempted, but achieved. By afternoon, a courier arrived with new orders. The Egyptian front had paused, but reinforcements were massing further south. Patrol flights would begin again at sunset. No rest, no ceremony. The Air Force would survive by staying in motion. The men nodded without complaint. They were too tired to celebrate and too proud to stop. In Tel Aviv, news spread through whispers. Our planes drove them back. Radios repeated the story cautiously, uncertain whether to believe it. Some claimed British pilots had intervened. Others said divine providence had turned the tide. No one knew about the handful of men who had taken off from Ekron in machines older than themselves. Their names did not yet matter. What mattered was that the city still existed. As night fell again, the lights of Tel Aviv flickered on for the first time in days. Cafes reopened, windows glowed faintly, and the rhythm of life hesitantly resumed. On Allenby Street, people walked without looking up. Somewhere deep inside, they still expected sirens to return, but the sky remained quiet. The silence itself became a kind of music, a fragile lullaby written in the absence of fear. Far above, patrol flights traced slow arcs along the coast. The Avias, patched and trembling, moved like shadows. They were not there to fight, but to watch, to remind the world below that the air was no longer empty. Each engine note carried across the waves, echoing faintly over the rooftops and out to sea. For Alon, the silence was heavier than the sound of battle. In the stillness of his cockpit, he felt the loneliness of command, the knowledge that peace was only a pause between storms. He looked down at the sleeping city, the lights scattered like stars reflected in water. This was what they were fighting for. Not victory, but the fragile right to rest without fear. At midnight, he landed again, dust curling around the wheels. The airfield lights were dimmed to preserve fuel. He climbed from the plane, stretching stiff muscles, and listened. In every direction, the land was quiet. Somewhere, the Mediterranean whispered against the shore. For a moment, he let himself believe the war was over. It wasn't. But for that single night, it felt as though the sky itself had exhaled. The sound of engines faded into memory, replaced by the hum of crickets and the breath of a nation learning how to live again. Victory had no anthem, no parade, only silence. And in that silence, Israel began to dream. In London, the morning papers carried headlines that seemed almost unbelievable. Jewish pilots in German planes rout Egyptian army. Tel Aviv saved by 4 planes. The irony captured the world's attention. Survivors of the Holocaust, flying rebuilt Messerschmitts, had defeated Egyptian pilots trained by the British, and among them former Luftwaffe aces. It read like fiction, but it was not. It was the first sign that the new nation of Israel, born into siege, would not vanish quietly. Diplomats in Whitehall were uneasy. British advisors had equipped Egypt's army, supplied its aircraft, and trained its pilots. Now their protégés had been humiliated by a state they had tried to prevent. Inside the Foreign Office, reports circulated in careful language. The Jews appear to possess an air capability previously underestimated. In private, the tone was sharper. They are not to be taken lightly. In Cairo, the mood was different. Shock turned to denial. Military spokesmen dismissed the loss as minor disruption, blaming mechanical failure and miscommunication. But among Egyptian officers, anger brewed. Their advance had stalled, their prestige wounded. The stories spread through the ranks, tales of phantom planes, impossible maneuvers, divine intervention. Some soldiers swore that British or American pilots had secretly flown for the Jews. The truth, that 4 inexperienced men had done it with courage and luck, was too humiliating to accept. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts at the State Department studied the reports with fascination. Israel had no allies, no arms industry, and almost no pilots. Yet it had achieved what no one expected: command of its own air. American correspondents in Tel Aviv described the event as a miracle of improvisation. The phrase would endure. For the Israelis, there was no time for pride. The fighting continued. Every day brought new raids, new losses, new challenges. But something intangible had changed. The psychological tide had turned. The world had seen that this fragile new nation could stand alone. And within its borders, morale soared. People who had spent their lives as refugees or soldiers under others' flags now felt the first weight of sovereignty. At Ekron, the airmen read fragments of the foreign press. One mechanic found a crumpled copy of a British newspaper with the headline circled in pencil. They laughed quietly, not with arrogance, but disbelief. No one had written those words for them before. For centuries, Jewish history had been written in exile. Now, for the first time, it was being written in the sky. The victory reshaped more than morale. It changed policy. Within weeks, Czechoslovakia agreed to expand arms shipments. More planes would come. Spitfires this time, not the cursed Avias. The Czech technicians, once skeptical, now treated their Israeli visitors with awe. The legend of the night of the first air battle spread through hangars, mess halls, and across continents. The British, still overseeing the final days of their mandate, began to withdraw faster. Their officers no longer trusted the intelligence coming from the field. Their authority eroded daily. They had underestimated what resolve could achieve without resources. Empire had met improvisation, and empire had blinked first. In Tel Aviv, artists painted the first posters of the young Air Force. Silhouettes of planes rising above the desert, blue stars of David cutting through red skies. The images were crude, idealized, but powerful. They did not depict individuals. The faces remained anonymous. The victory was collective, and its meaning larger than life. Around the world, the story became a symbol of survival, of rebirth, of defiance. To Jews still scattered across Europe's ruins, it meant that the helplessness of the ghettos and the camps was over. They could fight, and they could win. In Cairo, in London, in Washington, in Moscow, the message was clear. A nation had been born, not by proclamation, but by flight. And though the world still doubted its endurance, that single night over the desert proved a truth no government could unsee. Israel would not be erased. The war continued, but from that moment, the skies above the Middle East no longer belonged entirely to history's conquerors. They belonged, however briefly, to those who had learned to make courage their only weapon. Years later, veterans would describe that night in fragments: the smell of burning fuel, the hiss of the radios, the silence after the engines died. There were no medals, no triumphal parades. The men who had flown those first missions returned to the ground and vanished quietly into the rhythm of war, their names recorded only in notebooks and memory. Yet from that fragile beginning came a legacy that would shape a nation's soul. The Israeli Air Force was born not from strength, but from scarcity. A handful of planes, a few volunteers, and the conviction that survival depended on the courage to improvise. What began as desperation became doctrine. Every pilot who would later defend the skies of Israel traced his lineage back to that night, to the 4 men who took off from Ekron against an army, and returned as symbols of endurance. In the years that followed, the lessons of that battle turned into a code. Speed over numbers, initiative over command, ingenuity over fear. It was not just about flight, it was about identity. Israel had learned that existence itself was an act of defiance, that every mission began with doubt and ended with the choice to rise anyway. For the world beyond, the image remained haunting. Jewish pilots in German machines, rewriting history in the very sky that once hunted their people. The paradox became a mirror of the century itself, the ruins of one war repurposed to build the freedom of another. Out of ashes came motion. Out of silence, sound. Modi alone would not live to see the end of the war. Months later, his aircraft was hit while defending Tel Aviv from another attack. He crashed near the city he had saved, the first commander to fall. When the news reached the airfield, no one spoke. They stood in the same formation they had used on that first day, heads bowed to the wind. His name became the first engraved in the Air Force's memory, the first to remind those who came after that courage was a borrowed thing, passed from one hand to another, never owned, only carried. Decades later, in training bases scattered across the desert, young pilots still hear his name. Before their first solo flight, they are told the story of the night of the first air battle, how 4 planes took to the sky against the impossible, and how one nation learned to breathe because they did. The details have blurred with time, but the essence remains. They remember the silence, the fire, the improbable return. They remember that freedom, once won, must always be flown toward again. At the Air Force Museum in Hatzarim, an Avia S-199 stands behind glass. Its paint is faded, its wings dented, its body rusted by sand. Visitors walk past it without knowing that this wreck once carried a country on its back. The museum labels it simply, 1st Squadron 1948. Nothing more is needed. The plane speaks for itself, a machine built for war that found its purpose in rescue. History, too, flies in circles. The same sky that had once been a symbol of oppression became the canvas of rebirth. The same machines that once served destruction became tools of salvation. And the same people who had once looked upward in fear now owned the horizon. On quiet evenings over the Negev, Israeli pilots still cut their paths across the stars. Their engines echo faintly against the desert floor, a heartbeat of continuity that never stops. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the voices of that first night. 4 engines, uneven, defiant, climbing toward dawn. They did not fight for victory. They fought for existence, and won both. They flew patched machines into eternity, and came back as a nation.